In episode 3 of the ReFi Podcast, John and I have loads of fun speaking to Michael Kelly and Fred Fournier from Open Forest Protocol. OFP is a really innovative technology that's trying to crack the nut of what they call MRV, Measurement, Reporting, and Verification for forestry projects. Right now, there are loads of people around the world with land that could be turned into forests, but they don't have the right economic incentives to do so. The current market of registries creates a huge bottleneck for smaller landholders that ultimately prevents us from sequestering carbon into the soil at scale. By unpacking this technology and its implications for the future, hopefully we give listeners a better insight into the missing pieces of the puzzle for scaling meaningful climate action in Web3. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll stay tuned for next week where we've got another awesome interview about to drop. I'd love to just hear the story. How did Open Forest Protocol begin? How did you guys meet? What was the evolution of all of this?
So my journey basically, got into Mike's journey about a year back, but it started way back. Actually, it started in 2005. I was traveling Southeast Asia, in Burma and Thailand, and I was witnessing post-fire destruction, and that basically when the whole thing started. It then kind of ignite a spark to do something about this. I came back from that trip, tried to launch an NGO to help sustainable reforestation projects. That failed for many reasons, but being young, not having the network, capacities, competencies, whatever, and then around 2017, I restarted the same idea with my co-founder Aurélien, and this time we were pretty successful. And by doing so, we actually found out that one of the main issues we were finding was to have a good report from those projects we were supporting. So they were on different levels of reporting, but one of the main important one was what was happening on the field. I mean, we knew they were planting trees, we knew they were doing great things, but didn't have really exactly what we expected. Being scientists, we wanted something that was pretty squared, and so also ultimately we found out that this MRV piece, as we call it, MRV stands for Measurement, Reporting, and Verification, that was missing basically was kind of the whole problem on funding those projects. Because if we were able to get a good sense of what they were doing, being transparent, being trustful, then eventually even us as an organization will fund them more, but other people will fund them more, or just starting funding them. So that's kind of where I came from this whole discussion and thinking. And at some point I realized that our small organization would not really scale, and that we needed something that was a lot more useful and actually a technical tool. And that's how I thought about blockchain. And I reached out to an old friend who was actually in this industry in Switzerland. And that's where he connected me to Michael, saying, hey, I know a guy who is thinking about the same things as you are, but on the blockchain side of things. And that's how basically the conversation started with Michael a bit more than a year back now.
Yeah, that's pretty much I guess the connection point for our two separate pathways. I think, Fred, you started a little bit earlier than I did, relatively speaking. So I'm a crypto guy. I got into the crypto space in 2016, early 2017, started kind of learning about it. Stayed in the space for a long time, saw a lot of the rises and falls of protocols and different experiments that happened in that bull market. Towards the end of the bull market, a friend of mine who's a professor of sustainability, Richard Miller, he's actually an advisor to the project. He reached out and we basically did some weekend sessions because he said, how could we use blockchain to create some type of sustainable reforestation or avoided forest destruction kind of app at the time, thinking in the very the original jargon of the internet. We spent a good amount of time thinking through it because Rich was actually working with the World Bank on a project to try to reforest a bunch of trees in Pakistan. And what that basically turned into was like a very simple white paper that we started shipping around amongst the climate industry. And eventually it was that exact same white paper that Fred ended up, I ended up sharing with Fred after we got connected through our mutual contact. And it was kind of the takeoff point for what we were doing. So, yeah. 2 different pathways awesome. Randomly connecting, and here we are.
That's so cool. It seems like this is the theme for the whole ReFi movement over the last couple of years, just like the right people connecting at the right time. It seems like climate change finally has a worthy nemesis, and yeah, just grateful to discover you guys. I actually found your protocol quite early in my journey, looking for who is doing meaningful work at the intersection of climate action and crypto, and you guys were out there and was super excited. And I'm just curious, like, what's happened? Where are you at? What's the state of the product? What's your funding situation? How much have you raised capital to date? And when can people like us get our hands on it? Want to learn more behind the scenes.
If I can actually say something before on the topic of climate crypto, I was thinking about this earlier and it just came up, but like, I really want to be honest with the fact that like, in order for us to have done OFP, it needed 2 people fully submerged in both the climate world and the crypto world to make this possible. Like, there is no way in a million years that I would have been able to have done, anything on my side without having the understanding of the on the ground status of the forest industry, where Fred's coming from, and the kind of insights that he's giving. So I think that's really good just for people to keep in mind, like the industry cluster as a whole that we're in right now, it's kind of a hybrid animal, because there's so many different like inputs that are required to do it well. I don't know of any single person who like kind of fully encapsulate that. It's a really collaborative space in that way. So just want to like use that as like the tee off, because yeah.
Yeah, totally. And just the kind of intellectual humility to say that the problem space of both areas, both crypto and climate change, are so vast. Like, it requires specialization and expertise, and that heart of collaboration is totally key. So yeah, we'd just love to get an overview behind the scenes where you guys are at, product evolution, team size, funding, like, and when people can get their hands on what you're building.
Sure. Let's start with the product then. Maybe it's an easy way to start the conversation. So basically our product is a first and foremost, or maybe not first and foremost, but first, an app that you can use on the field to report on the forest status. It is based on the methodology that exists today on forest monitoring that you will find. So it's nothing new. What is new is the way of implementing it on an app that you can easily use for basically anyone to use. If they are, if they have like 15, 20 minutes of teaching, they will be able to use that. But of course, the prerequisite here is that they need to know about their forest. They need to know how to measure a tree, take a picture of a tree. So basically, that's what it's required here. The app is going to be used by people to go on their plot, being large or small or medium size, whatever the size, and they'll have sampling points, and they'll go around those sampling points, tagging a few trees, like around 15 trees per sampling points, tagging the tree, taking a picture, a diameter and a height. They'll be doing that for their projects every 6 months for the first 2 years, and then every year for the duration of the project. Once they are done with the field measurements, then they can upload the data onto a dashboard where you can have one project or multiple projects depending on the size of your organization and how you're structured. And once you're ready, your data is cleaned, you can then upload that data to basically the validation process, which is now on the blockchain. And that's how the mechanics of the blockchain starts, where you have a community of validators. So there will be probably tens, if not hundreds, in a few years of companies validating the data, and the companies validating the data, they have to basically check the data submitted against the previous year or previous data set to see if it's genuine or not. And if they think it's genuine, then the data is going to be put on the blockchain forever. So we, have this mechanism to make sure we have genuine and good data that is put on the blockchain. So that's kind of the whole system, how it works. Maybe as Mike is the CPO, I'll let him also explain me a bit more the details of the product here.
No, that was well put. I think kind of just to use this as runway for the future stuff that we're building. So essentially, we have a dashboard for projects to collect data from the field. We have a network of validators to validate that data. We call that internally like the engine, the eternal engine, because essentially what that does is that's kind of the structure from which we can then talk about introducing some form of carbon methodology to allow for the creation of carbon financing for those forest projects, and in parallel to that, to connect carbon financing directly from some type of financing platform on a results basis. So the projects upload data. If the data is approved, then cha-ching, the financing unlocks and it goes to the projects, and it's based on that structure. So for where we are right now, we are finishing up the testnet launch of the eternal engine. So basically the mobile app, the project dashboard, and the validation area, that's undergoing like final tests in preparation for mainnet launch. The year ahead is pretty much going to be the financing platform, the carbon methodology, governance, and all the other fun gadgets that we want to build out as well.
So cool. I love what you guys are doing. This is amazing. This is exactly what we need. So kudos to you both for getting to this point. I'm curious to understand, I haven't heard the mention of third-party registries like Vera or Gold Standard to date. Are those actors in this system, or where do they play in this context?
Well, I guess, they are the actors today. We are not yet. So basically what they do is they kind of do the same thing that we want to do, but for basically bigger projects and in a broader industry, because we are focused on forestation only. And they're not only focused on forestation, they're focused on many other things. It could be renewable energy, it could be a lot of different things. So we are, if we want to differentiate, the two things is that we are a lot more focused, so we will not do anything else than forestation, at least in the first step. And the second thing is that we are community-based, so we don't have, we don't send 1 or 2 person out to a project. It's going to be the projects uploading their data, so they will be owning their data and responsible for what they do. And then it's going to be a community validating the data. So it's a completely different approach than the actual approach. I don't think it's going to play against it because, huge projects, they don't necessarily need this technology because, they get the funding, they can sell their eventually carbon credits if they create any. What we focus more are, in our case, are smaller and medium-sized projects where you can unlock capital today, and you can actually you don't have any solution to prove what you're doing. So eventually, it's going to be 2 solutions existing together. Hopefully, at some point, we'll be able to talk together, see how we can collaborate. We don't see exactly how now, but it's totally possible with what we're building.
I think that's a really key and quite a powerful insight, right? That these consensus technologies can, especially early on, best serve us by complementing the existing systems, right? So rather than trying to come in and compete with a market segment that's already well served by the legacy market, finding and it's usually like the poorly connected or kind of too small to justify the cost of customer acquisition type of market actors that we can connect to with this new system of, but essentially it's like, I think of crypto and blockchains as like a system of value transfer, right? Communicating value. I guess on that note, I'm kind of reminded of Ibiza Network, which is insurance for smallholder farmers, and they have essentially discovered that you can provide this coverage for a lot of people who don't have access to traditional insurance because it's just not worth going and finding people that will only pay $1 a month for insurance. I'd love to hear about the experience you've had engaging with these kinds of smaller and medium scale projects, and really kind of delving into the community piece. Who are you speaking with? What are their questions they're asking? How have you been adapting what you're doing to meet them where they are?
Yeah, super interesting questions. Should I go, Mike? You okay? Yeah, cool. So basically, we are talking with projects, I would say, at 3 different levels for the moment. So we have a first set of projects that are country level projects. We've been starting those discussions when we went to the COP last year in Glasgow. We've had very interesting feedback from countries saying, wow, what you're developing here would be super helpful, not so much in terms of carbon finance, but in terms of MRV and transparency, because they don't see any system like that. So they've been really interested, and we start discussions with them. Of course, those discussions will take longer. You're not talking to one small project. You're talking to diverse set of people at governmental level. But we have those discussions with Kenya ongoing, Ivory Coast, Malawi, Panama, a few other countries. And it's very interesting to see where they are now in terms of trying to implement something at national level. And to be honest, at the moment, we haven't seen something that is really focused like we are and proposing a good solution. And we'll see. Maybe it's going to be a good collaboration. So that's kind of the first level of conversations. The second level of conversations are with what we call multiple projects organizations. Most of them would be big NGOs, I would say here. So we've been talking to Eden Reforestation or Trees for the Future. Those are American-based. We're also trying to talk to WeForest, European-based big NGO. And they are more interested in the carbon aspect because they have already, lots of projects around the world. Those projects are sometimes small, sometimes medium-sized. Not so much huge projects, but they're really interested to see if they can implement a solution that will be doing MRV and eventually the carbon on top of that. And the last sets of discussions are really single projects. And we've been having discussions mainly in, I would say, Africa for the moment, and a few in South America. There, it's either a conservation project or a community-based project with some people starting a project at local level, farmers, whoever, that want to find a good solution for them that is not too costly, that is easy to implement, and that they can manage themselves. So they are super interested in exploring with us. And at the moment, what we're doing is piloting a few projects with those kind of organizations mainly. We're not piloting with countries and multiple project organizations at the moment. There are more like small projects on the ground to really meet those expectations and to make sure that the product can be used by them.
And so how many people are actually actively piloting this right now on the ground?
So we have 10 projects piloting on the ground. Of course, it's the first set of piloting, I would say, because our product is the first version. It's going to be launched in a few months, but then of course we will keep piloting with bigger and bigger organizations. That's how I see it, coming. The conversation we've had with Eden, for instance, is the first conversation. They were really interested, but say, guys, with you we'll be piloting once we have a first version of our product.
I was just curious to understand the economic model here. You kind of mentioned the two use cases of somebody planting a new forest or protecting an existing forest. And in my climate change boot camp at Terra.do, I learned, the rate at which trees sequester carbon really takes a lot of time until they're mature. And so protecting a mature tree from getting cut down for even just one more year has a quantifiable carbon benefit. Like, what are the economic incentives here for people to use your protocol, both on the ground from that perspective, but also the validators? Like, what are we looking at here, and how does that compare to existing alternatives?
Okay, so there's a couple of angles of how to take it. I think the simplest one is essentially that from the project perspective, projects basically get whitelisted. They jump on the protocol, they upload data. The data permanently sticks to show the full life cycle of their project, and depending on whether they're doing reforestation or avoided deforestation, the carbon financing component comes in terms of the maturity of their forests. Where we see the value going in kind of the long term is essentially when a project is uploading data consistently every 6 months for the first 2 years, every year henceforth after that, that's confidence inspiring for money on the sidelines to jump in, because they have ultimately a direct channel to direct their funds in a way where the funds are only released if the project data upload is approved or deemed to be correct. So from our side, in the climate space, Rich always brings up the fact that the Norwegian sovereign fund has like $1 billion for forests sitting on the sideline. They haven't committed it. They've been in talks to put it into Indonesia for a long time. They haven't wanted to do that because there's no assurance that the money's actually going to go to keeping trees in the ground. So like all things considered from the project perspective, when the financing platform goes live, the projects in themselves will have the carbon financing option. They'll also have the direct fundraise option from people interested in a form of like results-based climate finance, if you will. That's from the project side. From the validator side, it really falls into kind of the larger crypto-economic model. The larger crypto-economic model is relatively simple. The OPN token is a utility governance token that also has the potential to build in a yield function too, which I'll get to. But in simple terms, you use OPN to stake on the outcome of the data uploads, and from that you yield OPN from the reward pool, right? So pretty simple staking mechanism that's just been updated for this kind of type of data validation. The really, I think, innovative component is when you're talking about validating data that allows for the creation of what would be an on-chain carbon credit, then you can do really cool things by linking the new carbon credit with the existing protocol-wide token. And so I always kind of ascribe it to say in traditional legacy carbon certification standards, you have a centralized company that'll go, charge 50 to 60 grand, do a methodology, let the project get their carbon credits, and then, okay, you guys are off to your own, go find someone to sell your carbon credits to, and, the job's been done. When we upgrade this to a protocol level, we are effectively using the protocol as the certifier of the carbon credits, and the protocol is taking a portion of the carbon credits created by the project and distributing it out to token holders. So the vision here is essentially that, there's a finite amount of tokens. The tokens are useful for making the protocol work, but more than anything, the tokens become an anchor from which all future carbon minted on the protocol can eventually yield to. And then the rest is just math and numbers of seeing how many projects you can bring onto the protocol, how many tokens there are, and how it runs. Yeah.
So this is a decentralized network of validators in the sense of like we're validating the credibility and integrity of these forest projects. Is that the kind of key premise here?
I would say yes, but I think from the way that it's structured, it's more like the validators are policemen. So they're validating that there has not been anomalous activity or mischief on behalf of the projects. The default kind of assumption from the way that the projects have to behave is the projects are committing to 30 years to their project. They're putting data on chain. They're uploading geolocated photos. They're getting whitelisted to participate. It's very hard, in a traditional kind of like hands-off, free-for-all crypto economic system, you kind of have to suspect every single stakeholder coming in. Forests change that a little bit because it's pretty hard to have a stakeholder that can pull it off when you're talking about thousands and thousands of trees in the ground that they have to upload data for every 6 months for the first 2 years, and then every year after that, right? Like it's way different than running a prediction market or something like that. Yeah, but that's the idea.
Sybil attacks are a bit harder when it's a physical forest, or on the internet nobody knows you're a dog, but you can tell that this forest is in this place. Yeah, I can see that. I guess I kind of hear as well some symmetry with the optimistic roll-ups world of like, we're gonna assume that this is true unless we find evidence of some kind of misbehavior. Is that it?
Yeah, you could definitely see it that way. I think to add to that though, there's kind of this like element of compounding network effects where like what we're ultimately doing is we're putting an infrastructure in place now that to some extent lives on chain, but we're betting on a network growing around that infrastructure with a diverse set of skills and a level up in technology available and the cost of that technology to make much, much more difficult what already tends to be a bit of a hard feat, right? So I guess you could say like it is in line with that optimistic kind of game theory, base model of validation, but it also gets much, much, much more, hands-on when you talk about, getting a satellite validator, or getting, bringing people in. We just actually had a call with a validator. This is super cool. They called Ghost Forest. They want to audit our forest projects by randomly flying to these forest projects and flying drones over the areas and just meeting the people randomly, right? So like you never know where these people are going to pop up or like what they're interested in doing. But once the kind of core rails of the network are set, all of a sudden it becomes much more than just, assume correct intention and vote, no if you see a problem, right? It becomes much more stringent in that way.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the different data inputs that could help validate the carbon sequestration in each of these projects, and love the idea of piping in satellite imagery and drones and like having the forestry police just pop on your door and take a look as well. That is super cool. And I'm just curious to understand a bit around like the size of the market here, the size of the opportunity. I've read a little bit about the area of land on the earth that could be forests, how much carbon that could sequester, but also like the economic value of this. How do you guys see this market at Open Forest Protocol?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I mean, it's also a difficult question because, some studies actually showed how much you can reforest, which is interesting. We're talking about a trillion trees in 2030. We're talking about lots of, surface that can be not only reforested but restored. But ultimately, what you have to look at is who is going to do the job. Who are the people out there able to, restore those ecosystems? And mostly, what we're looking at here for doing our analysis is how many projects that are there not able to find, the regular type of financing through Vera and when we started on a mission in 2018 by doing a mapping of those projects, we found, and we worked almost 6 months on it, not full time, but we took a long time doing that. We found hundreds and hundreds of projects, and now, which is not super huge, but and now when a few years later, if you go to Restore, which is a platform for helping projects like that on a scientific level, you find already more than 100,000 projects like that. So, I mean, and nobody has the answer on how many projects eventually could be doing that. But the interesting part is that already in a few years, we were at 100 projects. Now we are more than 100,000 projects. Eventually, once the people start getting the money to restore, that will actually trigger other people around to do the same thing if there is an incentive, and actually a financial incentive to do so. So here it's very hard to assess, but what I would say is that there's a lot of projects needing financing. enough projects for a protocol like us. And once we start, and if this is successful, we are untapping almost an unlimited value of community farmers around the world that could do this type of projects.
The current rate, sometimes when we're chilling, we go on, we look at how much is actively being deforested today. And if you just look around, right, like I'd say we're still going negative in terms of the year for year. I think in Brazil alone, it was like something like 6 million hectares, or don't quote me on that number, but there's a very large amount of forest that's going, that's basically getting eradicated. We were not even dipping into that side of the problem yet. We're still talking about getting other areas of the earth protected before it gets cut down. There's a couple of other things I think in that market niche, if I could just add to it since we're on the topic, that is fun to talk about, and that tends to relate to the capacity to tokenize natural capital in general. So we had a call with a professor Costa Rica who has a LIDAR satellite that basically can map a forest project using crypto voxels, like a similar way to crypto voxels to display the attributes of the project. And he was basically coming to us and saying, when are we going to be able to tokenize the co-benefits of a forest project that's on the protocol, and then use that in the financing, or use that in the collateralization, or use that in what's going on? So the market is actually twofold. The market is in some sense like applicable forest land and deforested land, but then beyond that, it's a digital infrastructure for natural capital once the forest project is contained. Waterfalls, special types of species, things like this. And the question is just, how does that get built out? How does it get monetized? Who wants to do that kind of building into it? But I think that's the direction where we're going for sure.
Totally. And I was actually going to double click on that just to emphasize that by creating a decentralized digital MRV protocol, you will enable this new level of price discovery, which wasn't possible before. And obviously you've got validators who could check the circumference of a tree, but there's IoT devices. Neil Spackman's been talking about measuring biodiversity with, on the ground sensors, and you can stream that data on chain. And so I think, to me, this is so incredibly exciting because it suddenly creates really clear price mechanisms for saying, protecting a tree in the Amazon rainforest has this quantifiable benefit versus just planting a new tree somewhere in North America where there aren't trees that previously exist. So yeah, cannot overemphasize the power of that point.
So can we I'd like to dive a little deeper in what you mean by this digital infrastructure, right? Because we've kind of often gloss over this idea of like, oh yeah, you put it on a blockchain. It's like, okay, so what does that mean? And obviously this is in the context of so I don't know that much about Near protocol, right? But like Ethereum mainnet is not a place to store a lot of data. It's extremely expensive to store a lot of data. It's distributed across a bunch of computers. So, but at the same time, I guess what's your approach to creating in your first comments, Fred, I kind of thought to myself, you were talking about how a lot of these capital providers are a bit hesitant because they can't verify for themselves due to sort of inadequate MRV systems. And that kind of feels like there's some similar kind of this don't trust verify world also applies to the carbon credit world as well. So I'm curious how in this digital infrastructure you kind of approach these trade-offs of like large volumes of data storage potentially compared to these like kind of resource constrained blockchain environments. And can you speak a little bit to that?
I can take it. Fred, you want to take this one?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So the simple the simple like kind of skeleton that hopefully jumpstarts a larger ReFi ecosystem is the validation outcomes of the data that's uploaded. It obviously is recorded on chain. The outcome is written into the NFT metadata of the projects that have been minted. But what I think the way that we foresee this going forward is we want to allow other entrepreneurs to be able to come forward propose their own vertical to use our validators and to use the timers that's set with the validators, and to kind of trust them to basically manage it however they want to manage it best. So that could be in the form of like it could be a private application with private data storage, private database, where they basically are like the middleman that connects tons and tons of projects to this core validator that like sends the data. For what we're doing on the side of Forests, and this has kind of been a really ongoing point with the kind of discussion with the projects, discussion of the build out, is like we're trying to put as much of the data as possible into IPFS, and then basically the IPFS ID goes into the metadata of the NFT. But what we're running into is like, if we want to give projects the functionality to delete certain uploads, to edit certain data, to store certain data, whatever, they need more, data needs than what would be like a bare bones skeleton chain, infrastructure that's going to cost them a lot of money. So we're probably going to end up building in, to a certain extent, private databases for some of the extra data held by the projects, within the dashboard, within the mobile app, but still provide them the opportunity to decide how much data they want to put on chain via what they end up putting into IPFS, and then what ends up getting written in the NFT metadata. Now, the cool thing on Near, I should add, is that there's a new product on Near called Chromecat. And Chromecat was built by Trevor and Mike, and I have to give them credit. I'm on the board of the DAO as well, but they're the real builders and innovators around it. Chromecat really allows for automated function calls that you can kind of hook into your product on the back end underneath the surface, so people can't really see when, for example, a transaction fee is being paid, when storage might be covered, when an NFT might be minted ahead of time for somebody. You can basically prepay certain key functions of the blockchain underneath the surface, kind of rolling, so that the projects can come on, participate, and basically you can cover them at least for a certain amount of time, depending on how expensive it gets, or how much they want to use it to kind of facilitate that usability component of it. But to simply put, I don't think there's a clear-cut solution to that problem to this point. I think that there's a lot of experimentation. If you look at Ethereum today, this was actually just on Twitter. It was someone said, what would happen if Infura went down for Ethereum, right? What would happen if 90% of Ethereum, they say is related to Infura, a lot of extra infrastructures is built on. How this evolves, not clear, not sure. Depends with the builders that want to, come and use it. Depends the urgency of the climate space. I think that's one of our biggest trade-offs, is like, we could do this expensive, hard to use, fully decentralized model, or we could compromise and have a more lean middle model that's, semi, it has the essentials that go on into IPFS, it has the essentials that go on chain, but we provide a little more buffer so that the experience is, 10, 20 times better. Absolutely. Fred, I don't know if you're going to add anything to this.
Yeah, I think looking at, for a non-blockchain guy, I jumped in blockchain a year back, so I'm still young in this space, and what we're experiencing and the feedback we're getting from the projects is that why do I need to create a Near account? I mean, and even though it's just a click and they go by it, then it's like, there's a question, why do I need that? And then if we can remove that, that's a little bit of, question, and they don't see that they're creating a Near account, it would be perfect. But, this is the technology evolving at the speed, at their own speed. So already we are in a situation with Near that we can build a really integrated Web 2 experience. I think, from coming from out of that space, which is super nice. And hopefully, a few years from now, we'll have an experience where nobody knows it's on blockchain. And that's cool. Why do you need to know it's on blockchain?
Yeah.
The challenge is actually not doing all of the jobs at once, I think. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to go to a group of environmental consultants and say, here's all the infrastructure you need to tap into our protocol. Build your own app, build your own, take our dashboard or take our, field app. It's going to be open sourced, use it, dress it up, add in, an API for your own proprietary technology, and then white label, sell it to your customers in a traditional kind of client user relationship, but use us underneath the surface. And that could be for World Bank projects, that could be for Red Plus projects, it could be for a host of things. At this point, the big trade-off is like, how much do we focus on just building the core infrastructure, and how much do we focus on building the core infrastructure and something that's actually going to generate users and actually be usable and actually kind of jumpstart this new ecosystem?
Yeah, what I'm hearing here, which I love, is this very pragmatic approach, right? Like, I think progressive decentralization can be interpreted in a lot of ways, and that includes in the tech infrastructure and like the architecture. So if you're using a Postgres database for part of this, but like you got people using it and it's making a real world impact, then as long as we can relax our decentralization maximalism a little bit because you're absolutely right, like eventually we hopefully will get to where we have hyper sophisticated, massively scalable, fully decentralized peer-to-peer spatial data applications, and but we can't wait. First of all, we can't wait for this to come online to start using this technology for what needs to be applied to. But also, this experimentation and this kind of gathering this feedback from the stakeholder groups is what we need to know to inform the development of that kind of technology, right? So it's like, I think it's so important and brilliant, yeah. And I think too, with this, like, why do you need blockchain, or like, why do I need to know it's a blockchain to sort of like abstract away the Web3 experience? And what I'd really like to see is where like it's a default Web 2 experience, but you have the option to do kind of take custody of your data, control your own private keys, if you know what to look for, if you know to click on the special box, that kind of thing. But I think especially with your user group, right? Like Forest project operators aren't like MetaMask experts.
Yeah, it's a very important point for us, and I'd like to add the fact that we'll have people that are knowledgeable about blockchain. Validators will be somehow knowledgeable about blockchain. We'll tell them how it works. But most projects we won't explain in the details how it works. But eventually, a few years from now, they'll be using the system. They'll be kind of understanding what's happening, and they'll be eventually interested to take another role or to deep dive or be part of the community with a different angle. And they'll be at that point ready to go a step further and learn about how the system works, learn about blockchain as a whole, which is super good. But to bring them, people in trying to do something good in Africa, telling them about, you have to put it, you can put, and if you want to move forward, you have to put an MRV system in place, and already, trying to explain about blockchain is going to be too fast, too complicated. You have to go one step at a time, really explain why you do MRV, start doing this, and then eventually move on to the next level, so to say.
Totally. And also just embracing that it's progressive and large scale systemic change takes time. Evolution didn't happen in a day. Decentralization won't either. And embracing that, like you said, Michael, climate change is happening really fast. And every day that we wait, every, molecule of greenhouse gas that goes into the atmosphere is lost time and lost temperature. So I appreciate that. I'd really enjoy kind of looking at the climate financing part of the ecosystem a little bit, and diving into a bit of a greater detail of who you think is going to be, contributing this capital and how some of that flow would look. So I understand that, a forestry project on the ground that is too small for the likes of Vera or Gold Standard can use Open Forest Protocol to validate and, receive financing from outside actors. And one of the key pieces that is a problematic aspect of Vera is that it takes them 5 years to issue the credits, and then once you issue the credits, they're gone, and there's no capital flow to incentivize you to continue to maintain that forest. And so I'd love to try and understand a little bit better about like who you see the primary actors in the climate financing space are, and how this annual check-in that you guys have of validating forest health every year after the 2-year marker plays into that capital flow.
So let me maybe start with the capital flow. The capital flow, once we implement or Carbon is implemented, it's going to be a yearly flow. So that's already a big difference, because you'll have the necessary data to basically release the carbon that is attached to that data. So it's going to be a flow that is more regular, and that the project can plan to have and anticipate to have, because the project know how the forest, the conserved forest or the reforested zone is evolving. They know if it's just freshly planted, you basically know that you want to get much carbon out of the forest. If it's a 5-10 years forest, depending where it is, then of course you'll get some more. So the first thing is that you will have at least a yearly income, which is very important for keep your project growing, but also developing other projects around. So that's the first thing. And the second question was more about who the people would be interested in financing those projects. I can start by saying, coming from that space, I can start by saying that philanthropic organizations, foundations that usually are in this space funding project, they'll be pretty interested to at least have access to who is doing what, and then deciding on where they want to put their money and at which state they want to put their money. That is one way of financing those projects. The other option, of course, is the whole voluntary carbon market that could be interested in those credits and buy those credits directly from the projects instead of buying them from whoever is middleman or trader. And eventually, traders and companies sourcing projects or sourcing carbon will be also interested. We've already talked to a few of them, and they're all interested because one of the main problems today is finding quality carbon credits, if we talk about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say from the crypto side, there's ultimately from the perspective of the protocol, the monetization pathway is actually twofold. The first one is as Fred said, the projects upload data and they receive some form of carbon financing for the data they provided. The second avenue is through what we call Open Forest Starter, which is the financing platform that will basically connect to this infrastructure for anyone in the Web3 space or beyond the Web3 space to basically pool money and finance these projects in a results-based way with the functionality, which is, it's possible to do when we get there, is the question to allow for them to actually receive a return in some of the carbon financing that they might put money in for, right? So I wrote down here in the notes, just a kind of short list of stakeholders that would be interested in doing this, right? So DAOs is the first one. You can imagine, we saw what Constitution DAO did 2-3 weeks ago in fundraising to try to buy a copy of the U.S. Constitution. You can imagine a DAO forming saying, we're going to buy up ecosystem hotspots in the Amazon and Indonesia, and we're either going to put our own forest operators on the ground to collect that carbon and basically yield carbon as a net profit, or we're just going to sprinkle fund a bunch of different projects with certain conditions to get a 10% yield from their carbon to our DAO for guaranteed payments for the next 15-20 years. That same logic pretty much follows the rest of the Web3 stack. So you could build a DEX, you could take a sushi swap model DEX, where a certain percent of the transaction fees automatically goes to a pool to finance a forest, and then would receive a certain amount of carbon from that pool. You could be an NFT marketplace doing the same thing. You could be an individual NFT artist where a section of the royalties goes to a forest pool. And then probably the most interesting one that we recently ran into is that there was actually a group of people we were talking to that said, we want half of our stablecoin reserve to be backed by natural capital. And so we're interested in potentially backing our stablecoin with these forests in the ground in a mutually beneficial feedback loop where they basically say, here's a bunch of value that was backing our stablecoin reserves. Now we're going to basically put this into funding 70 different forest projects for the next 100 years, and forests now back our reserve. It's actually kind of mind-boggling what's possible. So I just wanted to add that in on the crypto side. For the crypto people, it's wiggy. You're dude, this is going to be really interesting.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on all of this. I think, the fact that by connecting or bringing them into this sort of DeFi financial environment or financial ecosystem, it just unlocks so much utility with these carbon credits is mad. And you think about like physical carbon sinks. A forest is a physical carbon sink, right? But if you have a collateral reserve backing a stablecoin, that's this sort of carbon sink in the value sphere or in the value domain, which is you locking that carbon up for a long time. That's a new source of demand for carbon credits that's not matching them with the negative externality that is polluting, right? And I think that's a super exciting, probably the reason why I'm most excited about bringing carbon credits onto blockchains. I'm curious so I kind of think I've pieced together this like a network of validator, like proof of forest validators. Then does the open forest protocol produced carbon credit tokens? Like, is that kind of like, I'm kind of seeing that this optimistic forest validation setup you've got is kind of the methodology, right? Like you're saying there's carbon in these forests and we've got a system for you to be confident in that because these people are submitting their attestations that this is real with photos and all this. You got this network of validators that are making sure it's all true. So we're confident that there's this much carbon locked up in this system. Then what happens with, like, where do those carbon credits come from or go or live, or where can I buy them? Where can I use them? Is that part of the protocol?
We have to be careful. I would say that the community has the ability to make it part of the protocol. And so what that would look like is if the community should wish to make it part of the protocol, there would be a community proposed methodology that would ultimately be your inputs. So the community methodology would say, we're going to take these inputs from these forest operators on the ground floor, and when they send their data to the validators, while the data is being validated, we're going to run their inputs through this methodology, and the methodology will basically spit out, the amount of carbon credits that the forest would be entitled to. If the validation upload is confirmed and affirmed, then the number of carbon credits would be minted and it would be sent to the forest project's NFT, with the protocol taking the fee from the protocol. In theory, the community, meaning in some form of DAO governance, would also be able to iterate and update this methodology over time. So in essence, it would be, a community governed carbon methodology where people would be able to put their inputs and say, we want this to be, required in order to create what would be an open carbon credit or something. Once the carbon is created, it lives and dies on chain. So, the wallet that we're building out will have an offset function built in. So you'll be able to offset your carbon credits on chain. It'll generate a nice certificate. But beyond that, if the projects don't want to directly offset, there's a world of infrastructure that can potentially integrate with these carbon credits. And we're looking to work with people who are going to really focus on that part of the equation, because I think it's very important. You could think of regional marketplaces. You could think of carbon dexes. You could think of using it for collateral and loans, or connecting to the existing ReFi infrastructure. A Klima DAO, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, so powerful. And I really appreciate how confidently you've drawn the boundaries around your protocol in terms of what you're doing and what you're not doing. I think to me, that's a really clear sign that you guys have the experience to deliver on the breadth of this vision. Because often you see people just taking on too much, trying to do everything, and not really harnessing the power of composability and allowing other people to build. And so I think I just want to double click on some of the key areas that I hear. One is entrepreneurs suggesting a different vertical about carbon sequestration through a different method. What comes to mind is enhanced rock mineralization, which Future Forest Co. is pioneering, and they're developing the science and having to figure out how to verify it. And if they can propose this methodology to the likes of an open forest protocol, and that can then be governed by the same community that's governing forestry and leveraging that same knowledge, same capital flows, you have an incredibly powerful capital coordination vehicle to, scale carbon sequestration. And so, I'm super optimistic about this. And I also then, start to think about what's happened with Toucan protocol and creating, pooled carbon assets. BCT obviously in the first, and Raf and James announced NBCT in the My Climate Journey podcast, the nature-based carbon ton. And this really allows for a kind of semi-differentiated carbon market with very high liquidity to drive price discovery, right? If you guys have somebody in your community who's building up a nature-based carbon sequestration method that issues credits every single year at this rate based upon the data that coming in through your validator, that could then be pooled and really release that capital into the likes of the Toucan protocol, which then can really subvert one of the key flaws that I see, which is a project going to OFP and also going to Vera. Because if all of those Vera credits and gold standard credits aren't also coming on chain, you have this kind of risk of double accounting as far as I can see it. I'd be curious to hear what you both have thought about that.
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. So the way we see that is that once, for the moment we're talking about MRV, but once we talk about carbon and once the community has, decided to move through carbon, then we'll have to make sure the projects are not already certified in another registry. I mean, that's going to be a necessary pre-check to do on all projects, because we don't want that, of course. So, of course, we'll have to find a way to do this. For the moment, I think I'm not like super knowledgeable about all registries worldwide, but I think that's going to be probably in some cases manual. But hopefully, those registries will be digital at some point in the future, and we could have a process where it's going to be registered or checked automatically. So that's kind of the things we have to look for. And of course, there are other issues than just the registries, but issues about the baseline, the leakage that needs to be tackled, because those things are also super important.
But don't you think that's the role of this kind of market-based approach to validators? That's what I just heard from this ghost forest example, that you're going to have this real diversification of different ways of checking to make sure that these forests, right? So it feels to me like leakage almost might just get swept up in that. If these validators are well, maybe that's a question, right? How are these validators incentivized to do this? Presumably, if you catch somebody who's misbehaving, you get a reward, right? Can you talk a little bit about that, kind of the game theory and crypto economics of the validator role?
Yeah. Before that, I just want to kind of go. You said something right before when you were talking about Ghost Forest. So essentially, I think the way that we think of it is we are very humbly providing the rails for kind of attacking a massive existing system, extremely complex thing, and we're kind of providing a very nicely structured entry point where there's going to be a lot of a lot of different things going on while this is getting off the ground. My tendency kind of today is to be let's let the protocol grow, and let's just embrace the fact that there's going to be, friction points, and try to mitigate the friction points as much as possible with the different tools that we have on hand. So one of those tools, which we've talked about before, is until we have a carbon methodology that can actually be seriously backed with some type of satellite, with some type of very, very granular way of looking at it, we will just lowball the estimate. So we'll put, a 30% reduction on the carbon uploads as an example, right? We haven't finalized the exact amount, but we can just put a 30% reduction on the carbon uploads as a part of the methodology, as a quality assurance measure to protect against some type of uncertainty involved in that. Fred, do you want to add something before we get into validation?
But also just a second, I think that piece is so important because the research is very clear that preventing emissions and sequestering emissions have a different net climate impact, right? So taking 1 ton of carbon out of the atmosphere after it's been emitted still has a positive forcing effect on temperature. And so it's kind of a misnomer that in the current carbon credit accounting system, net zero is going to result in a stabilized climate. It's not. Actually, we need to make sure that we're issuing carbon in a way that if we are doing this kind of 1-to-1, 1 ton emitted versus 1 ton sequestered model, that actually the net effect is a stabilized climate. And what you've just said, Michael, is that carbon issuance methodology is open source, and it can be audited and it can be revised by a community of experts who know what they're doing and can take data and say, actually, this isn't working. We need to downgrade the issuance here. So, just want to put that in terms of big picture context.
No, that's very important what you just said. I mean, the community aspect of what we want to put in place here has implications that we can't even think of today, because we are at a certain level of knowledge. If you think about climate change 20 years back, people were talking about it, but they didn't have any issues on the temperature we will face end of this century or things like that, and they wouldn't be able to tell you all the risk associated to it. So and science will evolve quite fast, hopefully quite fast on this topic, and we have to adapt fast too. That is kind of the aim of the whole open source system.
So John, I didn't want to detract from your question about validation. I'm gonna get another shot at explaining it, because I feel like every time I explain it, I get a little better at explaining like how the mechanics work. It's like 2 months ago, it was ugly, man. Like it would have been really, really bad. You guys have to tell me, how this essentially goes. But there's ultimately 2 tiers of validation. You have your MRV structure of validation, and then you would have what would be some form of a carbon form of validation. And I'll get into like the slight differences on each, but the general principle that kind of is imbued in whether validation works or not is that truth can be coordinated more easily and more naturally than falsehood. So what we basically do is we set up a validation structure where every validation period runs for 40 days. 30 days validation period, 7-day challenge period, 3-day resolution period. Every single validator is looking at a certain data input that's coming in about a forest project, and they're having to make a decision on their own about the veracity of that data. And so basically what they're doing is they're looking at the sample points from the trees, they're looking at the geolocated photos or other information that the project might have provided, and they can compare that to the historical record of what the project has provided up until that point, right? So you can see, how the measurements have changed in the last 6 months to last year, et cetera. They then have to stake a certain number of tokens in the initial validation period on the outcome that they think is accurate without being able to see how other validators are staking their tokens. So basically, they have to, go off of what they believe to be true, or, they could coordinate and discuss if you got like a ghost forest that went to a place, Ghost Forest writes up a long report that says we audited this, here's what we found. Obviously, that's a coordination mechanism in itself that's going to be helpful for making a decision. You stake on that outcome, and after the 30 days go through, the results are shown. And so, like, let's say, for example, between the 4 of us, the results are 10-2, right? So 10 people said yes, 2 people said no. Now, the 2 people who said no, their tokens unlocked, they get their tokens back. A 7-day challenge period opens up where there's the opportunity to try to override the initial vote, right? So basically, the people who originally put 2 tokens, they can look at the data, they can look at the people who voted yes, they can put in 11 tokens and say, we think that you guys are wrong, and we're putting in 11 tokens. Again, they can't see who's doing this, so they can only see for themselves. At the end of the 7 days, show of cards, let's say, for example, they did it. They challenged the data outcome. We now have 11 versus 10. The people who originally voted correct, their 10 tokens unlock. Now they have another 7 days to basically put forward 22 tokens. So it escalates. You have to double the amount that's required for validation. And that's, I think, what in the kind of game theory literature is known as an escalation game, right? What ultimately this leads to is a coordination problem more than anything. That you need to be able, if you're going to try to cheat the system, you need to be able to mass coordinate, negative votes against it without actually seeing or knowing if they're voting that way until the very end of the outcome. And from the other side of the aisle, if you are on the wrong side of the outcome, so like let's say that you're part of the 2 people that voted no and no one challenges it, then you lost out in that validation. You win no rewards. You get nothing for it, right? So you basically wasted your time, and your capital has been, not monetized, not been, increasing in value. When if you had just kind of been truthful, that's I guess the theory of it. If you had just been truthful, then you would have gotten value for your capital. Now the carbon level is a little different, and this game theory is really gnarly because the question that came to us was like, how do you build a game theory system when you're creating a new asset from nothing? So like think about that from the perspective, right? If a validator is getting a data upload for carbon, and if they all vote yes, then this carbon credit is introduced, the projects get their carbon, and the protocol takes a percentage of the carbon, everyone wins. But if they vote no, then nobody wins. Like, sure, they'll get a reward for voting no, but why would you vote no and not get your carbon when you could vote yes and get your reward and your carbon? And this is where we basically designed a kind of mechanism to counterbalance that called the collateral area. So the way that the collateral area works is, and this is to kind of answer the point of carbon validation. In normal validation, your MRV data upload, the data sent, you stake on the outcome, escalates, it resolves, how it ends. With carbon validation, a certain amount of collateral is going to be required to be locked up, basically vouching for the veracity of the project for their carbon data upload. If the collateral is not locked up by the time of the data of the data upload's resolution, then then no carbon credits are issued. Then it doesn't matter if the resolution was correct. If the project is not collateralized, then the carbon credits do not get brought onto the protocol. If the project is collateralized, then what we have is a separate rewards pool. It's another 2% rewards pool that goes to collateral providers if the data upload is approved. If the data upload is denied, then that 2% rewards pool goes to the validators, and the validators get double rewards for denying a carbon data upload. So the kind of premise is the logic underlying this is like, projects need to get collateralized to upload data. If a project uploads a bad data upload, then basically people just locked up their collateral for 40 days. They got nothing for it, right? They just like wasted 40 days of time on assets, getting nothing for it. The incentive to then collateralize the same project again is probably going to be pretty difficult, right? The sense that you're going to naturally say, okay, this project failed once. What makes us think they're going to do a good job again? Probably not going to collateralize them. We're going to put our capital towards other projects where we do think that we're going to have, a sizable amount to earn a reward. That's kind of the two-pronged mechanism for validation of the data. Yeah.
Is there anything you wanted to touch on, John, in that space?
No, I guess this is the Oracle problem, right? Like, how can we bring information that's not on the blockchain onto the blockchain in a way that is consistently true? Whether that's the price of Ether in dollars or how much carbon is sequestered in this forest in Sri Lanka. And so I think, again here, like, I completely agree, John. This is the value of building the open and this sort of kind of Web3 ethos of there are so many different people experimenting with these kinds of questions. And it's this sort of Darwinian approach, right? Like, we're having this diversification of ideas and approaches, and some of them will succeed, and all of them, especially since like memes can cross-pollinate much more easily than genes, everything is strengthening together. So I love that. And I think I probably have to read the docs a little more closely to really get it. I'll say that. But no, it's just, I guess, so like the TLDR there was the two steps, MRV and carbon. The first one is whether or not it had to do with like, is this credible? And then what is the volume or the amount of carbon sequestered? Is that right? Just like in the highest level?
Yes, okay. Basically. And
okay.
I'd like to add something here is that we're building a system where we're talking a lot about carbon that is going to come, but the system could very well be used only for MRV if that's a need for you, for your project, because already it's a big step forward for most projects to have a consistent MRV system in place. It's already a big change, and it's already a big change in communicating outside what you're doing. So of course the carbon is really good because it brings more capital, it brings value to natural ecosystem, but the MRV itself could be of use for many projects.
I think also one thing to add is that you mentioned the Oracle problem. For me personally, what I think makes this work is the time frame. So it's the time component of this. The Oracle problem is very, very different when you're trying to validate an off-chain data on-chain as fast as possible because of a transaction, because of a trade, because of some type of information that you need immediately. But when you control the time frame, when you say, your project and you're going to upload data every 6 months for the first 2 years, and every data upload is going to take 40 days, you're basically slowing down and expanding the moment that the data from off-chain comes on-chain, which gives the relevant actors much more time to check the veracity of that and to do their due diligence than what you would get resolving a prediction market where it's like, okay, we've got to resolve it in the next 12 hours, go. That to me is the big changing input here. I will be interested to see ultimately if you guys know Flux Protocol. They basically have a very, very similar game theory based Oracle design, but the big difference, I guess, is the time frame for their resolution and a couple of the crypto economics facets as well. So that's kind of the bet we're making in a sense. Is we're trusting with the future development of verification technologies, the future growth of a network, and fixed timeframes with a sense of permanence and transparency built into that at least for the forest problem, we're going to be able to have reasonable off-chain data that's going to basically be able to be validated on-chain. Whether it works or not, it's for us to execute and do.
Yeah, which in itself unlocks a huge bottleneck in terms of delivering climate financing to scale forestation and sequester carbon. So I so appreciate that. I want to understand how we as a ReFi community can help you guys. What do you need? What can we do?
Oh. Well, I can start with the humor. The humor is, we love the collaborative element of ReFi. So we built in a large amount of ecosystem tokens, actually largely for building alliances in the ReFi space. So we want to be able to partner with other projects, give them skin in the game, give them, votes on the DAO, etc., to have them, connect in some way to the protocol. So 7 million tokens is reserved for ecosystem development, so to speak. That's there's only 44 million at launch. So that's a pretty big chunk that we're reserving as runway to kind of, make this into a really, a collaborative effort. For the rest of the space, I think having discussions like this, and more than anything, I'm a big composability guy. So I'm a big, I love talking all about how we can take value in one space and add, a pipeline and, dribble a little bit of value from that space into something else. I think it's really important that as, different ReFi projects start to evolve, that there's a way of hopefully sharing that value for the mutual benefit of the different stakeholders. So building those alliances, getting that infrastructure in place. And then for me personally, there's a big, underlying narrative here of we have the opportunity to green crypto. We have the opportunity to really prove that crypto can be a green industry, that people don't need to associate it with energy consumption through Bitcoin, and that these ecosystem treasuries can offset on-chain or with a ReFi product connected in some way to really change the way people look at our space as a whole. That's my side. I don't know, Fred, are you, if you had anything on that topic?
Yeah, I'll totally agree with that. I would say that for me, the most important thing are discussions like that, because I didn't know much about crypto, found out that it's probably very useful for resolving some of the big issues we have today. Some people in crypto don't see the climate issue that much. So it's really actually proving to the world that we can have a big impact by bridging those two things together and working as still a small community, right? Not so many people are focused on those two things at the moment, but I really think we can, show that it's going to make a difference. We're not going to resolve all the problems of the climate, for sure not, but we have our share to do. And so the more we can talk about what we do, onboard like-minded people, people that want to change, things from this world, I think, that could be already a big step forward.
Oh, take it, bro. It's cool.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. How the reason that the climate is changing like it is because of a coordination failure, and everyone talks about how blockchains are coordination tools, and I think I kind of been thinking about how the way I think about it is that crypto is a global player in an international game. And that means that we can, think about this conversation, right? We're having calls with people from multiple nationalities, multiple countries. We're all kind of coordinating over the same idea, which is really, in the information age, how humanity works, right? Like, we can speak to each other anywhere in the world. And we have these antique borders, to borrow a term from Nathan Schneider in a recent post that he put, that kind of create these arguably arbitrary kind of friction points in the way that we work together. But I'm curious about kind of tying it into John's questions earlier about community, right? Like, what's your experience been building the OFP community? What's surprising you? How are you finding the response of people around the world to what you're trying to do, and like, what are they bringing to the table that you didn't expect?
Wow, that is a very deep question. I love this one. Well, they are bringing things that you won't expect. That's the beauty of it, right? It's well, at least I can speak with my small experience, international experience. I've been doing projects in Africa and in some other countries around the world, but it's always one conversation with a very specific set of people for one specific topic. So you don't get outside of that, that conversation that much. You are there for a project talking with certain people, right? In that space now, with this open forest project, you're talking to a lot of different people. Really, it's like mind-blowing. People call you up. They are artists. They are communication people. You have conversation in very different directions, which is a risk, but which is really also at the same time very good, because then you can onboard people like that in your team eventually, because they will bring something that you haven't thought of, or they bring perspective or competencies that you don't have. And I think that's really the beauty of what we're doing now, is that if you have an open team, so to say, or diverse team, and you're open to embrace that diversity, I think you're much better than with a very narrow vision on doing things.
When you were saying, John, about the whole kind of new global player that we are, I love that. To me, the narrative is like, this is the return of the Jedi. You know what I mean? Like we're the resistance here. We're coordinating with a bunch of coders in their house, making different ideas of how to change this protocol. And it's kind of like all of these people from all these different backgrounds are exiting the traditional track, and we have the potential to build like a supercharged fast track that's super powerful, way OP tech. If this was a video game, we'd be coming in with the weapons that's multiple levels stronger than what the normal crowd is used to using. That really, for me, is this is what we have the opportunity to do in the next 10 years. And the token is what makes that possible, right? Because the buy-in from a random guy sitting at his computer in a basement somewhere who's never heard of us before is, I bought in, I'm part of this community, I have some token, I have a vote, I'm interested in seeing this benefit everyone else who's participating. That kind of, I think, in terms of the direct community component, the corpsmen which is our kind of crypto side community, was basically what we want to have as like our crypto army of builders, promoters, connectors, facilitators. In crypto terms, you might call them degenerates, degens. But the kind of, I think that the idea behind this is, we've seen, at least from my background in the space, communities are really, really important for making projects survive through bear markets, through ensuring that messaging is clearly communicated, and also for just letting the network effects take off. Like when you invest in a community, you're basically investing in people just being themselves and bringing in other like-minded people. So you're not controlling the process. You're letting everyone else just kind of like, you're letting the process take on a life of its own. Our vision with the Corpsman is to pretty much do that with the OFP community, and we have the token reservations to fund the Corpsman. Every Corpsman gets 300 OPN token a month, and we basically fund the Corpsman. We have budget for the coming years to get them off the ground and to give a robust community buy-in to what we're trying to do.
And it reminded me of something that I read in your website or documentation about a specific interest to reach indigenous people and kind of marginalized groups. And I'm curious to know, like, are you actively seeking out some of these individuals to participate in the system? I get the Corpsman contributor program, but I'm curious how you can really unlock the power of diversity in terms of that member in your community as well.
So at the moment, we don't have, a direct project with indigenous people, but we have conversation with a lot of organizations that are in contact with them and that are super interested in exploring how we can, set up projects with them. So we're not directly in contact, but very soon we'll be. It's going to be very interesting for us to see how they will fit within this new tech world, and see their reactions, see if they like it, they don't like it, if it brings value to them. Ultimately, I think that if they can understand the underlying value of creating value for what they own or what they cherish the most, it's going to work. But of course, there are some places on this earth, even making contact with those people is difficult. So the challenges are bigger than just talking about community-based projects, restoration, regeneration in places where you can access. Those are the more challenging. And you have basically, we won't be the one reaching out to them. People who are already in contact with them will be doing that job and proposing OFP if that makes sense in this context.
Totally. I think one of the reasons why I was so excited on that was in my investigation, I've learned that in many ways, indigenous people are kind of on the forefront of fighting the climate change battle at the, aggression of the fossil fuel interests and institutions. In Canada, there are so many conflicts going on right now all across the board about indigenous land stewards who are being, forcibly evacuated from their homes, sometimes even at gunpoint, because of pipelines coming in and other factors. And the interesting thing for me, I'll share a link in the show notes from this incredible talk by a young woman from a tribe in Canada at COP26. And I really feel that these cultures actually possess one of the key identity narratives that humanity as a whole needs to adopt, which is that we are utterly dependent upon these thriving ecosystems for our survival. And in the same way that through millennia, they developed cultures and communities which really reflected that identity, that we are not separate from the forest, we're not separate from the earth, that when the forest dies, we end up in a similar place, that actually this narrative, this identity is something we really need to embrace. And I think it is a really true statement that sometimes these groups are hard to reach, but actually I feel in my heart that this is part of our role and obligation as, stewards of this, carbon money, this money of transition, to try and reach the unreached and give them power and autonomy in controlling their own land and subverting the unfortunate effects of industrialization, of colonialism. So curious to get your guys' thoughts on that. I know there was a lot there.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, I have a very good example of that. An organization called NIHT. It's a US based incorporation, also foundation. They reached out 2 years back. They reached out to us, and what they did was pretty impressive. I was actually very surprised. What they did is they created a company in Papua New Guinea with locals, with the clans, and they decided, instead of selling the trees to timber companies, the clans are owning the forest, so it's in that case it's pretty easy to know what they want to do. But they were previously selling the trees to timber companies to make some money, and then they decided to do something else. They decided just to conserve the forest and to get a little bit of carbon every year from the forest. And they did a whole long process with Vera, 7 years, and they got that money. And now today what they're doing is they're just conserving the forest, and they make kind of the same money than previously, which is a super nice business model, because they can live the life the same way they were, doing it 50 years back, getting some money in for what they need, and they're not protecting the forest instead of destroying it.
So if I can come in kind of from the more boring product side of approaching this problem, we're really hoping that this next generation of climate entrepreneurs builds some of these integrations that we really could use on the community side for the protocol. So for example, you could imagine an integration or a plugin for projects where it basically is, something by the name of like source a local field agent. And then there's some type of buy-in for the local person to go check the samples of the trees when the projects need to do it. And on a contract level, the local community that does this can receive carbon credits from the project directly as a part of their initial sign-on, agreement. That's waiting to be built. On the other side, you also have, on the level of validation, you could set up a regional validator. This is a little more down the development pipeline, but you could imagine a time where you're able to delegate to certain validators, right? So for example, like if you don't want to have to be the one to decide on the accuracy of it, you give your tokens to Ghost Forest because, you trust Ghost Forest to go visit. Well, you could imagine a similar scenario where we set up, a dozen, regional validators of local organizations that are in, forested communities where there's going to be a high density of projects. And then people can, stake tokens to those projects and they can earn part of the fee of the rewards for themselves. It's just the tip of the iceberg, really. And I think my hope is to find those people that want to put all their time and energy into working on these problems and giving them as much access to capital and support as possible to try to make it a reality, because it is possible with OFP, at least for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I just want to encourage everybody to check out openforestprotocol.org, jump in your Discord, follow you on Twitter, fill out a form if you're a project owner on the site, and connect with this movement, because my bet really is that this is a very integral piece of the future of forestry and the future of the carbon market. And so I've just been, incredibly grateful to have this opportunity to check in with you guys and learn more. I feel like both you guys come from such a wonderful place, and just a shame that we couldn't sit down and have a drink together afterwards.